Okay, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and finish off with Chapter 7, finish off on the Texas governorship. So last time, of course, we were in the first part of our discussion here with the chapter. Of course, we were talking about, um, you know, the eligibility requirements for the governorship in terms of, um, like age requirements and residency requirements. Of course, also looking at some personal characteristics. Also looking at in terms of how the governor is elected, in terms of them, running in a statewide election every 4 years during midterm elections. And so now we're going to get into what I would probably say is probably the most important part of the chapter, which is discussing the roles of the governor, both the formal and informal roles, both the roles that they do in terms of their actual office, the actual day-to-day responsibilities of being at the top of the Texas executive branch, but also, we're going to take a look at some more informal roles, such as being the de facto leader of the governor's particular political party. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that here. So let me go ahead and share the screen. Okay. All right. So we're also going to take a look at, before we get to the roles here, we're also going to take a look at this quick chart, which discusses leadership styles that governors have had in the past year. So, um, we have three types of leadership styles here, which is aggressive leadership, differential leadership, and cooperative leadership here. Um, and so what this is talking about here is that because of what we established in Tuesday's class, that the governorship in Texas is regarded as rather weak. And of course, that's not a surprise because of the 1876 Constitution, which really tried to roll back the powers of the governor because of E.J. Davis and the Radical Republicans. Governors have had to be creative with how they're able to get their agendas, passed, and in some cases, in some cases, governors aren't able to get their legislative agendas passed because of those weaknesses. But there are some ways that there are different ways that governors, both past and present, have how they've how would I say it how they have excuse me I guess how they've been able to adapt and how they've been able to to basically operate in terms of how they would perform their duties. So let's take a look at aggressive leadership first here. So this is defined as a governor who uses the status of his office to try to dominate Texas politics despite the structural weakness of the office. So examples would be Governor Clements and more recently Governor Rick Perry. So um, what's interesting about Governor Perry is that he was governor when I was about you all's age, when I was in college. In fact, he actually stopped by UTRGV, I believe, in the fall of 2002. He had an event there at the student union. So that was actually the first time I ever got to see a sitting governor of Texas. So I thought that was really cool. So I went to go hear him speak. There wasn't that many students there. There were some people who, because it was during the governor's election. So Rick Perry was running for, because he had become governor in 2000, and then in 2002, he was running to to officially be elected, right? Because he was appointed, well, not appointed, but he took on the role after George W. Bush left the Texas governorship to go and become president. So Governor Perry was he became governor, and then in 2002 he was running for reelection, and so he did stop by. It wasn't a campaign event; it was just an event to I forget what it was about. It was to promote something going on at UCRGV, but I do remember that there were some other people who were supporting his opponent, which at the time was Laredo businessman Tony Sanchez. He was also running for governor uh, against um, against Rick Perry. So, but the reason why I mentioned that is because with Rick Perry, he was he was notorious for, and as as we're going to see here when it comes to the veto power, in terms of using the veto power and also the threat of using the veto power. We talked about this last time that the veto power that the governor has, I would say, is even more. It can be even more fatal, I guess you could say, to bills than even the presidential veto because of the fact that the Texas legislature doesn't meet continuously. So because the Texas legislature only has a certain amount of time to meet, and if they've already adjourned, and then you've got a stack of bills to get to the governor's desk after the legislature's gone, then the governor vetoes it, it's pretty much, there's nothing that it cannot be overridden because the legislature is out of session. So Governor Perry was very good at using that, using the veto power and the threat of the veto power. So that's how he was able to kind of work around the restraints and the constraints that the Texas governorship had, and he was able to, some people would say that he basically was able to kind of, how would you say it, like that he definitely was able to be more successful in getting his agendas passed because of that threat of a veto, or to not even start on something if it was something that he was not in favor of. So if the legislature was wanting to propose some legislation that he did not agree with, then he would go out and say, don't even bother with this because it's even if it gets to my desk, I'm going to go ahead and veto it or things like that. So that's an aggressive style of leadership, right? Um, to put yourself out there and to basically verbally communicate the power that you have within the legislative process. Now, that's of course different from a more deferential leadership where a governor who lets the legislature initiate policy as the 1876 Constitution envisioned. So examples would be Preston Smith and Dolph Briscoe in the 1970s. So this is more of a kind of a wait and see approach where the legislature does their thing, they take the lead, and then the governor just kind of reacts to it. So in an aggressive leadership, the governor is more proactive by putting forth their agenda and basically trying to, make ensure that the legislature is going to buy into that agenda because of the governor's process within the legislative process, or at least their role within the legislative process. Whereas for differential, they just kind of take a laid back approach, and it's just like, well, you know, I'll just deal with it once it gets to my desk, type of thing. And then cooperative leadership is kind of a little bit of a mix of both. A governor who tries to be involved in decision making at every stage through negotiation with legislative leaders. So examples would be former Governor George W. Bush and current Governor Greg Abbott. So yeah, this is kind of like a little bit of a mix of these two, where um, governors are involved and they're intricately involved, but ultimately, of course, um, the legislature has to buy into what the governor is wanting for them to do, right? And George W. Bush was a good example of this, especially with his history of working with Democrats and being, a lot of bipartisanship. Because of course, you have to remember at the time that in the mid 1990s, when George W. Bush became governor, this was, of course, during a transition period where Republicans were finally starting to take control at the state level, but there was still plenty of Democrats who still, it wasn't a complete domination of Republican politics like it is today. So there were still some Democrats that did have political power in the state. So George W. Bush did take it upon himself to try to work with Democrats and back in the 90s. Uh, with Greg Abbott, maybe not so much as what we saw with George W. Bush. But again, you also have to keep in mind that it is a different political time now. Republicans are in complete control of the state politics, and they've been in control for many years. So Republicans can be, they can definitely kind of throw their weight around a little bit more because they have the political power to do so. But yeah, Greg Abbott is definitely very active when it comes to putting forth his agenda. You could make an argument that he may even be shifting more towards an aggressive leadership style, especially when it comes to um, recent initiatives like Operation Lone Star, when it comes to like having DPS assist with border security, and then his school voucher program recently. So you can make an argument that Greg Abbott may be moving more towards the aggressive leadership process. So maybe like a combination of maybe these two that's probably how I would probably look at Greg Abbott's leadership style. But again, because of the way the Texas Constitution is set up, and because the governor does have limits in terms of the powers that the governor has. Oh, and another great example with Governor Abbott was, of course, the emergency powers that he had during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, uh, and basically declaring states of emergency in the state. So that's of course a uh, a very important power the governor has, which we'll talk about right now, which Greg Abbott obviously, of course, uh, used at great length at the start of the pandemic here. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on now to the formal roles here. Okay, so these first couple of ones that we're going to take a look at, these of course are the like I said, the day-to-day operations of what the governor is supposed to be responsible for. So obviously, of course, the chief executive uh, definitely makes sense that this would be listed first because you could definitely say that this is the most pronounced, the most important formal role that the governor has is uh, his role as being the chief executive of the Texas executive, right? So when we look at this formal role in terms of what the governor does on a daily basis, excuse me, the governor has control over the state bureaucracy and appointment and removal, budgeting, planning, and supervisory and clemency powers, right? And we're going to go through all of those different types of powers right here. So again, this is pretty straightforward because an executive obviously is someone who's in charge of an entity or an organization. And there are certain responsibilities that go with being in charge of an organization, right? You have to make sure that the organization has money to be able to operate. You have to make sure that you're hiring people to be able to perform the intricate duties and responsibilities of the organization. You also have the ability to go and make changes if things aren't working out within an organization. So that, of course, is what a chief executive does, whether it's a CEO of a company or, of a governor of a state. Um, the 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 job itself as a chief executive is pretty much the same. It's just that if you're the governor of a state, the scope and magnitude of the importance of the job and how much control you have and how much money you are responsible for, to budget that definitely is magnified at a at a much greater level than let's say being like, like the head of a small company or something like that. So the the everyday roles itself are pretty similar. It's just that the scope and magnitude is a lot more. So long ballot elections lead to officials elected independently, so they feel no obligation to the governor. So again, we've talked about this at great length throughout this class, right? That this is why governors definitely have to be people I guess would you say, like people, like they definitely have to be able to forge good working relationships and being able to engage in diplomatic negotiations with other members throughout Texas government, especially members of the plural executive, because of the fact that, like I said before, Greg Abbott cannot tell Dan Patrick what to do, right? And so they have to be able to work together on legislation and crafting public policy. So governors definitely do have to be very diplomatic, especially when it comes to those high-ranking state officials. The governor is responsible for filling vacancies in the judiciary. So I mentioned before, and we'll talk about this more in the judiciary chapter, that the judges in Texas are elected. But if there's any type of vacancy that comes up, which could be for a variety of different reasons, such as, judge passes away or judge resigns, like in the case we saw a couple of years ago here. Um, there was a judge that resigned because he was involved, there were some criminal allegations, and so Governor Abbott appointed his name was Judge Fonseca, not the one that was in trouble, but Fonseca was the guy that was or I'm sorry, Fonseca was the judge that Governor Abbott appointed. He's actually trying to run for he's actually some of y'all may have seen some of those campaign signs here locally, but yeah, so he was appointed to take over the old judgeship, and then uh, and then of course he's trying to run for re-election and try to get it back. He's been defeated a couple times, but he still tries to run to try to get that judgeship back. Um, so we'll see how that goes. Of course, obviously the RGV still tends to be a Democrat-dominated state, but we are seeing more Republican gains here. So, but yeah, so that does happen every now and then where the governor will fill some vacancies. Texas is short of vacancies on the judiciary. Texas's short biennial legislative session permits the governor to make many interim appointments when the legislature is not in session. So, yeah, this is definitely a difference from the president because the president they call these recess appointments at the federal level, but the president doesn't have too many opportunities for this because Congress is either continuously in session or they might have like a skeleton crew that kind of for in a lot of cases for the purpose to not allow for the president to make these recess appointments. But because the Texas legislature does not meet continuously, and they go long stretches without meeting, they go like a year and a half without meeting. The governor does have the ability to make these interim appointments because government agencies have to operate. We can't just wait until the legislature comes back a year and a half later to um, to formally allow for the appointment process to go forward, right? So the governor can make these interim appointments in the meantime, while the legislature is not in session. So there are a lot of these. Power of incumbents. If a governor is reelected, they will be able to appoint all members of the board or commission by the middle of the second term. So right, so it takes 6 years to go through a cycle of of these appointed boards, right? So um let's say there's you have every 2 years you have the opportunity to make these appointments. So after it goes through three cycles and then it starts over again um after the 6 year, right? So if a governor is able to stay in power that long for 6 years, so they would win, they would get elected for the first term, and if they're able to win re-election, then by the middle of that second term, they will have gone through all the cycles when it comes to the appointment of these different boards. And so that's why when I say that Republicans have, pretty much they are pretty much in control of state politics, this is one of the ways that they do so, right? Because they've been in power for so long, they can appoint their own people, and those appointments, and of course, because as I mentioned before, that the governor is limited in terms of the removal of appointees. It has to be someone who the governor appointed. Um, that's why being governor for such a long time does give you that advantage of being able to then it makes it easier to remove appointees because these are the people that you have appointed, right? So the Texas governor also has only limited removal power, which deprives the governor of significant control over state agencies. So it's not like with the president, where if some of y'all remember a couple years ago during the Trump administration, where President Trump was letting go of all of these, cabinet members and all these, all the different secretaries within the cabinet. But Governor Abbott does not have that same type of power, right? Where first off, like I said, it has to be someone that he appointed, right? Now, of course, that's not really a problem anymore because he's been in power for so long. But in order to remove someone, again, it has to be someone that they've appointed. It also has to go through it also has to go through a process. It's not just, on the whims of the of the governor, right? And there's also, like we kind of talked about in the last chapter, there's also different there's state agencies have different types of organizational charts, and they have different types of supervisory types of setups. Like I mentioned, like with the TEA and the Texas Education Agency. So obviously, of course, you have Secretary of or the commissioner, right? The Education Commissioner, who heads TEA. But then, of course, you also have the elected state board of education. So the governor has to kind of share power with the state board when it comes to when it comes to these educational policy decisions. So again, and that's by design because again, the state of Texas wants to try to diffuse as much of that power, from the governor as possible, so that the governor doesn't become, so that the governor doesn't become more like a president when it comes to where the president has complete control of the executive branch. The Texas governor does not have that complete control. Okay, let's continue more with more chief executive roles. Okay, so budgeting, of course, is a very important um, responsibility that the governor has. However, though, the governor is limited here again because unlike the president who proposes the budget at the federal level, um, the governor definitely has input, but the governor's not the only person involved when it comes to the proposition of the budget. Now, of course, the governor does have the biennial budget message where the governor can, and this also, this is one of the powers the governor has, of course, being able to discuss his agenda and what he wants for the legislature to work on. But the governor is not the does not have the final call when it comes to when it comes to what the budget's going to look like. Lacks the strong formal budgetary powers of other executives, like I just mentioned, that normally that decision in terms of the proposition of the budget falls on the executive. But here in Texas, we have the Legislative Budget Board, which has dominated the budget process, right? So the governor does have input, but like I said, Legislative Budget Board is the entity that pretty much has, that makes the final calls and the final decisions when it comes to how the budget is ultimately going to look like. Now, also keep in mind, though, of course, that the governor does have the item veto power. So the governor, so at the end, the governor can make changes when the appropriations bill that deals with the state budget, once it gets to his desk, he can then go and make changes by striking out those portions. But the point I'm trying to make is that the governor is not the one who comes up with the budget on his own, so to speak. And then planning. So when combined with budgeting, the governor's planning power allows a stronger gubernatorial hand at the development of new programs and policy alternatives. So right, so when it comes to budgeting is more like the money, right, and how much everything's going to cost, and ultimately the bottom line when it comes to how expensive the state budget's going to be, or not, or also not so expensive. Planning, though, is also important because planning has to come first. Before, well, I'm sorry. The planning is important because if the governor's not able to get the money that he wants, then he can also focus where that money can go. So the point I'm trying to make is that if the governor doesn't have the ultimate authority to decide how much the state is going to spend, he does have um he does have discretion when it comes to how this money is going to be spent. So a good example of this would be uh, the money that's being allocated in DPS for Operation Lone Star, right? So now, granted, of course, that's something that Republicans as a whole in Texas would support, right? So he's not getting pushback from the legislature, at least from the from Republicans in the legislature about Operation Lone Star. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the governor does have the ability to to plan things out and when it comes to how initiatives are going to operate, let me kind of try to explain this a little bit better. So when it comes to this concept of planning, that because the governor is the chief executive, the governor is looked at as, he has the ability to take the lead when it comes to planning out how agencies are going to operate in terms of what agencies are going to focus on. Um, so while it does cost money to go ahead and propose these initiatives like Operation Lone Star, um, the legislature is not going to push back as much about the way that the agencies operate because that's more of an executive decision. That's more of an administrative decision, right? The because remember, if we go back to like our Constitution, like our US Constitution, and we go back to this whole concept of, the separation of powers, right? That legislatures are supposed to pass legislation and then the executive is supposed to enforce it, right? So when it comes to decisions with how to enforce laws and policies and how to, in terms of how they're going to be followed, the executive is supposed to take the lead on that. So that's why that's where the planning comes in, right? Where this is an example of the governor basically being an executive and saying, okay, this is the money that you're going to that I'm approved for. So now I'm going to use that money this way. I'm going to focus on these programs. I'm going to put forth these initiatives with these agencies because this is a priority that I'm making here. So that's basically what it. So I try. So I think that's a better explanation in terms of how the governor is able to, how the governor can kind of get around maybe not having as much money as they would want, but being able to, to plan with the money that is allocated to the governor. Okay, supervising also. So. The governor also has supervising authority when it comes to the overseeing the state agencies, because again, the governor is looked at as being at the top of the executive. Again, but there is some diffusion here because of the plural executive. So Now, the governor, of course, can request reports from state agencies, appoint board chairs, remove their own appointees, and use political influence to force hiring reductions or other conducts, right? So the governor definitely can be very proactive when it comes to the administration of state agencies, right? And these, of course, are some examples, right? So the governor can call up um, Education Commissioner Mike Morath. He's the head of TEA, so you could definitely call him up and request reports when it comes to like, and of course TEA does this on their own, right? One of the responsibilities the TEA is responsible for is to oversee the school districts in Texas and make sure that they are adhering to the state standards and all that, and so that's why the school districts will get report cards from TEA, and so TEA is already submitting a lot of data already. But the governor, of course, can definitely make like special requests when it comes to like specific reports that they're wanting. And like we said, the appointment power the governor has when it comes to appointed boards um is a big power that they have, as well as the VA. Like I said, the governor can remove appointees, but they have to be their own. And the governor can also put pressure on agencies to kind of cut back on spending, maybe not hire as many people. We also saw that um, you know, um, one of the Senate bills that was put forth was the removal of the diversity hires within state agencies as well as colleges and universities. Now, of course, that was a team effort, from the legislature and the governorship. But we can see how that, the governor definitely has, some strong influence um, when it comes to, putting pressure on state agencies, when it comes to the how they go about within their own internal operations. Now, the informal powers of supervision relies heavily on staff, though, because of the fact that there's so many state agencies, right? There's tons of state agencies, lots of colleges and universities, lots of school districts. So, the Texas government is huge in terms of the number of entities and the number of staff that work for the state government, whether directly or in a hybrid format, because school districts and colleges and universities are a little bit of a hybrid format when it comes to, I guess they are state employees, but they're also part of like local school districts and community college districts and things like that. Um, but yeah, so the because the state bureaucracy is so large, um, this is something the governor's not going to be able to do on his own, right? He's going to need for his staff to engage in those types of supervisory responsibilities, such as calling up the state agencies and just checking up on them and getting that information, and also communicating the governor's requests and desires for the state agencies and all that. Clemency. So, clemency, of course, you probably saw in the news that there was this one Texas inmate that where his stay of execution was he got a stay of execution, but that wasn't by Governor Abbott, though. Court stepped in and did that. So, the clemency power, and what we mean by clemency is to whether it's to call for a stay of execution or to ultimately um, pardon someone, although that's not, pardoning is more so at the federal level, but and there's different words for that. There's like commutations and clemency and all that. But basically, it pretty much means the same thing, where if someone has been sentenced and is like serving time, where basically either they are released and their records wiped clean, or maybe it's not, the record's not wiped clean, but they're allowed to leave. So there's different examples of it. But the point is that unlike the president, who has this broad pardoning power for federal crimes, the governor is very limited in that if the governor wanted to make a request to pardon someone, it would have to go through the parole board, and it's not something that the governor just has unilateral control over, unlike the president, right? So it does also have to be approved by this board if the governor wanted to make this request, for clemency of an inmate here. So okay, so that pretty much sums up chief executive. Let's get to chief legislator. Now, it's interesting to note that when we think of course, like the president or the governor, we think of them obviously, of course, as being members of the executive branch because they are. However, though, that doesn't mean that the executive branch doesn't have a role when it comes to legislative issues, right, or legislative responsibilities. We see that in Texas, where we have that interesting quirk that the lieutenant governor basically is, the presiding officer of the Texas Senate. So even though technically, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is part of the executive branch, you could make an argument he actually is his role is actually more so in the legislative branch. So that's, so we see that even in Texas that executives in Texas do have legislative roles. So being the chief legislator, the messaging power. And so again, what I want to mention is that for the chief legislator role, when it comes to the governor, it's a mix of both informal and formal power. So the messaging power is regarded as like an informal power because yes, the governor does have the ability to, speak to the legislature when it comes to like, giving the state of the state address and, calling on the legislature to work on certain initiatives. But that doesn't mean that the legislature has to go about doing that, right? Like I've mentioned before, one of Governor Abbott's major policy initiatives was the school voucher program that he was wanting for the legislature to pass, but ultimately was not successful in doing so. Um, as I mentioned before, because of rural Republicans in the Panhandle and rural parts of the state that were not they were not in favor of uh, the school voucher program, for different reasons that I mentioned before. But the point is that if the governor is going to want to try to get his to because of course the governor definitely is going to try to promote his policy agenda, right? He has every right to do so, right? Um, but he's going to have a pretty substantial power of persuasion, right? Remember, I always said that governors have to be very diplomatic and they have to be able to negotiate because of the fact that they are limited in what they can do when it comes to legislative matters, right? So they can put forth all of they can put forth their agenda as much as they want to, but the legislature has to try to buy into this, right? Now, there are more formal powers, right? So the messaging power, again, that's a little bit more informal because he cannot compel the legislature to do what he's asking them to do. Now, for the session power, the governor can call special sessions, and this is a pretty substantial power because the governor can call unlimited special sessions. There are no limits to this. Yes, they're only for 30 days. The governor can call multiple ones. He's done. Governor Abbott has called many special sessions over the last several years. In 2021, he called several. In he called several also uh, recently. Last year as well. So he's called many of these different special sessions. Um, again, trying to put forth his policy initiatives, but at the same time, the legislature does not have to they do not have to go they do not have to go about with what the governor is proposing. Now also keep in mind that the governor sets the agenda for what the legislature is going to work on. So in the special session, the governor does have the power to decide what the legislature can and cannot work on. So that's another important power, within the session power. And of course, the veto power, like I mentioned, the governor's strongest legislative power is the veto power, as I mentioned before, more so than the president because of the fact that the legislature does not meet continuously. So if it's June and Governor Abbott has a stack of bills and the legislature is already out, then he could veto all 10 of them and they're all gone. They're all dead. There's nothing that the legislature can do about it until they meet again in the next session. And then, if they want to try to reintroduce those again, they can do so. But yeah, that's a very strong power that the governor has. And like I mentioned, Governor Perry was very notorious for using this power as well as the threat of using it. And of course, the item veto, as I also mentioned before, this is where the governor can strike out portions of the appropriations bill for funding. And Governor Abbott has done this. He did this in 2021 um, when Texas Democrats left the special session. This was in the summer of 2021. Again, look this up on the Texas Tribune. It's pretty interesting. Where this, of course, was during the special session that the Governor Abbott called to deal with redistricting, right? Because we had just had the 2020 census. So now they had to, with the new census data, they now were tasked with redrawing the district lines for the congressional districts, the state legislative districts, and other districts, all that stuff. So Democrats were not they did not agree with the proposed the proposed maps and all that, so they took off to Washington. So Governor Abbott, um, what he did there was he basically was telling the Democrats that if they don't come back, that he was going to use the item veto to strike out, to not pay the staffers of those Democrat senators and representatives, right? So that's an example of where um, the item veto can also be used for political purposes. Okay, and as we've said here, and I know this is a little bit outdated here, um, but look at how when we look at the some of these these governors, and when it comes to the number of vetoes that they have issued. So look how Governor Perry, he vetoed 132 bills just in one legislative session, whereas Bill Clements, it took him more than 8 years to even get to get to 190. So Governor Perry was able to almost get to the number of vetoes that Bill Clements issued in um, in 8 years. And also, what's interesting is that notice how with Governor Clements, he's a Republican and he was working with the Democrat legislature. So you can make an argument that because of the differing political parties, that there might have been a risk to see a lot more vetoes, right? But with Governor Perry, he was still vetoing bills from his own party, right? So now, of course, keep in mind that the Republican Party looked different back then. About 20 years ago, there was still um, some there was still some, how do I say it? Like there was still some infighting between the more business-backed cosmopolitan Republicans and your more evangelical uh so it was the economic versus the social conservatives, basically. So but now it's kind of the social conservatives have kind of pretty much taken over the Republican Party here. And then of course Greg Abbott, not too many, but I think in more recent years we've probably seen a few more of these. So just interesting to kind of look at in terms of when the book says that Governor Rick Perry definitely used the veto power as much as he did, that's what it's talking about here. Okay, so let's talk about some more. So a couple more, and then we'll finish here for today because we're almost done here. Okay, so more formal roles. So um, Governor Abbott is also let's take a look at the law enforcement aspect. So Commander in Chief, also known as the top cop here. So he is looked at as pretty much the head of public safety, law enforcement within the state. And as I've said before, this is one of the most important, if not the most important powers that an executive is supposed to have within government. Is supposed to keep their citizens safe. And so Governor Abbott has definitely focused on this power, as we've mentioned before, right? And of course, you could also make an argument that there's been a lot of opportunities for him to step up and need to engage in this commander in chief role. Of course, obviously, of course, regardless of how people, regardless of their thoughts and feelings and agreement or disagreement about Governor Abbott's strong stance on border security within Texas, um, you still can't deny that that's, of course, obviously something that is, very important to him, and he's definitely devoting a lot of his time and attention to that, right? So that, of course, would go into this commander in chief role. We also saw this, of course, a couple of years ago, like I said, with COVID-19 pandemic when that started, when um, with Governor Abbott um, basically being in charge of the state response um, and basically taking that lead as opposed to like county health as opposed to like county commissioners and county judges. Instead it was the governor that was basically taking the lead on this. But again, those are just some examples. So the power to declare martial law, that has happened in Texas back in the early 1900s, where there was instability in the oil fields, where martial law was declared. This was around during the time of the Great Depression here, but it doesn't happen too often. The governor is also responsible for the state military forces, in particular the National Guard. So the governor can mobilize. So the interesting thing about the National Guard is that even though technically they are part of the U.S. military, But again, another example of federalism to try to share power where they mostly are under the control of the state governors in which they are stationed in, right? So now the president can nationalize the National Guard, but again, that would be in only an extreme emergency. So normally the National Guard is under the control of the state governors here, right? And of course, Governor Abbott has mobilized the National Guard to also assist with DPS with Operation Lone Star. And of course, the governor also is responsible for responding to natural disasters when it comes to like hurricanes, and Texas, of course, obviously, um, Florida, of course, they've had their share of hurricanes, more so this year, but Texas also had their share. They had Hurricane Beryl, back in July. Hurricane Harvey was also pretty bad back in 2017. So Texas does get some pretty bad hurricanes as well here. Not as much as some other parts of the Gulf Coast. But of course, again, also keep in mind that every year is different, right? This year, Florida's getting it pretty bad. Who knows? Maybe next year, Texas will again. So it's just every year is different. That's why we always have to keep track of hurricane season and things like that. Other former roles, chief of state, ceremonial pomp and circumstance to augment other roles. So of course, obviously being the looked at as the highest ranking state executive official, that of course comes with a lot of perks in terms of visibility, being able to have your own like security detail, being able to have being going to a lot of different events and being very visible, and just the of course have being able to live in the governor's mansion. There's just a lot of that kind of like celebrity status, so to speak, especially when you're the governor of such a visible state like Texas when it comes to because of the sheer amount of people that live in Texas. Now, this is sometimes coupled with the role of chief intergovernmental diplomat to become actively involved in economic negotiations. So, right, so the governor also is very big on engaging in trying to meet with other heads of state, like other governors, also trying to meet with the president, things like that. Now, of course, it does help when these different heads of states are members of the same party, right? So when you look at Governor Abbott and his interactions with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, obviously, of course, they're of the same political party, so they definitely have a lot in common, and they definitely tend to be very close when it comes to, um, helping each other out with state issues, and of course, and then when President Trump was president, him and Greg Abbott also had a lot more meetings together, and they had a lot, more of these cordial events and having. I know there was a couple years ago where Governor Abbott did travel to the White House to go meet with former President Trump when it came to the opening of the opening of some businesses in Texas and all that. And so that leads to the chief intergovernmental diplomat, right? The state's representative in all dealings with their states and with the national government. So that's why the governor will travel a lot to different to meet with other heads of state, as I mentioned here, because they're trying to sell their state as a good place to do business. That's why Governor Abbott recently on social media has been very vocal about trying to recruit businesses to come to Texas, trying to tout Texas as this economic powerhouse type of thing, right? He's been very vocal about that, and of course we've seen that a lot of these businesses have come to Texas, right? Such as like Elon Musk, with Tesla and SpaceX, right? So obviously, of course, Governor Abbott definitely has a strong working relationship with business leaders like Elon Musk as well and things like that. So right, and that's of course one of the major responsibilities of the governor is to try to, sell their state. Like I said, make sure, try to ensure that that businesses will look at Texas favorably to try to do business there. And then lastly, of course, we'll take a look at the informal roles because I know it's already going to be almost time here. Um, these are roles that the governor plays. Not these are not the day-to-day job description types of roles that the governor has, but instead these are roles that the governor has, of course, obviously because of their importance being governor, they're able to have these informal roles. Like so the chief of party, right? So the key figure at the state party conventions and usually is the leader of the party's delegation to national conventions. Like I was explaining on Tuesday, that I would certainly say that Governor Greg Abbott is definitely probably the highest when people ask, okay, who is the leader of the Texas Republicans? And then there's no official designation of that. We just have to look at in terms of like influence within the state and and just the ability to be able to lead um their respective political parties. I would definitely say that Greg Abbott, in my opinion, would be considered the top Republican in the state of Texas. So obviously, of course, that comes with a lot of responsibilities, such as not just attending the state party conventions, but basically leading them, as well as, like it says here, right, leading the delegation to the national convention, right? So Governor Abbott, of course, would be leading the Texas Republicans at the Republican National Convention that we had earlier this year. And of course, we're also going to see that the Texas governor usually does get a lot of attention when it comes to future presidential candidates and aspirations, right? Um, of course, we had George W. Bush become president. Rick Perry also ran for president in 2012, although he wasn't able to get too much support, although he did serve as Secretary of Energy under President Trump. So, he was able to to get some influence in Washington. And so we'll see if Governor Abbott is able to, if that's something that he wants to. Because I know some people have been making that assumption that he's thinking about running for president. So we'll see. Of course, it also, of course, depends on how this election goes. So, but we'll see how all that turns out. And then, of course, leader of the people. Most people are unaware of limitations of gubernatorial power, and this is just in general that most people, because they're not aware of the intricacies of government. That's why a lot of people get upset at the president when gas prices go up, when in reality it's a little more complicated than that. That's not to say that the president doesn't have some role in setting economic policy, but it's not like President Biden has like a button in like his desk at the Oval Office where he can raise the gas prices and lower them, right? There's more factors involved, right? So a similar situation exists where um, people in Texas probably think that the governor is like just the president, right? Where the governor has the same exact type of powers just at the state level. But as you're seeing here in our discussion here, that's definitely not the case. That the governor is very limited, but because the governor is very visible, people definitely do know Governor Abbott. Pretty much everyone in Texas who keeps up with the news knows who he is, and so the governors can use this influence as a key bargaining tool, right? Being able to speak to the people, right? Having that visibility and being able to get his message out is a way to put pressure on the Texas legislature to, to follow through with what the governor is wanting. And a populist approach to leadership, of course, is, we've talked about this before, that trying to speak to the people directly, trying to paint, especially like, because like I mentioned in 2021, that Governor Abbott was not happy when the Democrats left to Washington. So he was definitely engaging in this populist approach to, criticize the Democrats, and that's probably putting it lightly, and basically like trying to sway public opinion against the Democrats, and some of the rhetoric that was said. And like I said, you can look this up on like the Texas Tribune. You'll see that he was not happy with the Democrats leaving, and I totally do get his frustration on that in terms of because again, the reason why the Democrats were leaving was so that they could try to not meet quorum, and if they weren't able to meet the quorum requirements, then they wouldn't be able to get anything done during the legislative session. And that's why Governor Abbott kept calling different special sessions after special sessions to kind of wear the Democrats down, to make them to where they would have to come back and ultimately participate, which ultimately they did, because it just that um, even though the Democrats still were not happy with the way the district lines were drawn, ultimately that was um, they did have to come back, and ultimately they were they did participate in that. So okay, that pretty much sums up everything that I wanted for us to cover here for today. So let me go ahead and stop the share. And let me go ahead and also stop. Let me stop this here. So let me stop the recording.